Today we're going to look at one of the most popular parades Disney has ever created, the Main Street Electrical Parade. It is a parade that has more lives than a Cheshire Cat and has changed many times over its history. Let's go take a look at some Disneyland history and see the Main Street Electrical Parade. Well, hello there! My name's Jeremy and welcome back to Freeform Disney, where I talk about all aspects of Disney, from the animated movies to the theme parks to Star Wars, Marvel, and Pixar, and the TV shows, and everything else in between. And that is why it's Freeform. And keep coming back every day for new daily content. If you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Today it's time to take another journey through time in this episode of Disneyland history as we're looking at the Main Street Electrical Parade. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Disneyland proudly presents our spectacular festival pageant of nighttime magic and imagination in thousands of sparkling lights and electro-synthomagnetic musical sounds. The Main Street Electrical Parade. Now that would sound way cooler if it was done through a vocoder like you're used to in the Main Street Electrical Parade. So what is the Main Street Electrical Parade? If you're not familiar, it's a nighttime parade with over 500,000 lights on all of these really cool floats that are coming through. And it's got this amazing, super catchy music with kind of a techno-y feel to it, but also kind of being down to earth, while also intermixing Disney into the whole thing. Now, it originally ran from June of 1972 all the way through November of 1996 over at Disneyland. But it's been so popular that it's been at 5 different parks, it's had multiple revivals. Yeah, this is a huge parade. Now, these videos always take me a good bit of work in terms of researching because I really like to make sure I'm getting it as accurate as I feel I can. And I've done my best to nail down everything I'm going to tell you and make it as accurate as possible, which for this one is certainly not as easy as it sounds, as there are certainly some conflicting sources out there. And if you're curious to see some of those sources, go ahead and look down in the description. So how did the Main Street Electrical Parade start? Well, it was at the initiation of Card Walker, who was then president of the Walt Disney Company. He called this big old meeting between Bob Yanni and Ron Miziger. Bob Yanni was in charge of entertainment for Disneyland and Walt Disney World, while Ron over there was in charge of entertainment and show development underneath Bob Yanni. So Card Walker, what he was really looking for was Walt Disney World had just opened in 1971, and there was so much focus on that park that Disneyland was kind of being overlooked. And most people in Disneyland weren't sticking around the park after 6 o'clock. The fireworks just weren't enough to keep them there. So he wanted a new project and he wanted it quick. And Card was really looking for a parade to go keep people. So that was the directive and they went ahead and started thinking about it. I would also like to make a quick note about Barnett Richie being the original show director for the Main Street Electrical Parade. While I don't have a lot else to share with you about Barnett Richie's involvement, I'd be remiss not to note her at all in here. Now, Ron is the person who directly created the parade, and he went out looking for ideas, and some of the stuff that really inspired him were these big turn-of-the-century big cities. When they got electricity, they would have these big old parades where they had strings of lighted bulbs. And the other big thing that inspired him was the electrical water pageant that had popped up over at Walt Disney World for its opening. Now, that electrical water pageant? Interesting stuff to say about that one. So it was originally created for the opening events of Walt Disney World and was just kind of a temporary backdrop for the Polynesian luau. But it was so popular it became its own standalone show and continues and continues and continues. Now what it did was it had all these flat characters, whether it be, say, sea serpents or whatever the heck, that were lit up over top of the water over on Seven Seas Lagoon and Bay Lake. So these are the two main inspirations that Ron had in terms of creating the Main Street Electrical Parade. So the idea was, well, we're going to go put wheels on floats and we're going to go make it on land over going down Main Street. Now, before they could go further with it and get to a full planning stage, they had to figure out how to make it work. And they needed to figure out how that power source would happen. And that was actually a big hurdle, because whatever they used for power had to light the bulbs, power the actual units that would hopefully move, and power the sound system. Now, early on, the actual units didn't really move. They were actually pulled by people. That's part of how we got around that at the very beginning of the parade. Later on, that would change. What they found was that generators, the current car batteries, electrifying the tracks, and none of that really was going to be enough. But they had just started with these new batteries that had come out, these cool NiCad batteries, nickel cadmium, and it was enough to make it so the parade could run one direction, change the batteries, and then later run it the other direction. And this was found out by good old electrical engineer Jerry Hefferly, who was in charge of figuring that out, and really he had a whole week to figure it out. I mean, big deadline, because it was one of those they were looking at possibly scrapping the whole project if they couldn't come to a solution. With that solved, they had the go-ahead, and that meant it was into full planning in January and February. Now, they originally went with a contractor called Silvestri, who was the only company that actually was making those tiny Christmas lights here in the US. And it actually took a lot of work for the colored lights because you had to hand dip them into a color medium for all of those colors. It's like, oof. Yeah. Now, Disney decided to put all the work over to Silvestri because they had the experience, and so they would be constructing the floats and putting all the lights on. But things weren't quite going well. Construction was falling behind, and they weren't going to be able to complete the floats in time. So, what did Disney do? What did Ron and Bob Yanni go ahead and do? Well, they went ahead and took all of those floats in 14 moving vans from Chicago, took them all the way back down to California, set up some large circus tents in the back area of Disneyland, got a huge crew of electricians, carpenters, etc., and, well, they went to work. They only had a few weeks left until the announced opening. Now, there were originally going to be a whole bunch of rehearsals to make sure that they actually got it right, but they knocked that all the way down to just two rehearsals because they needed that much time to actually work on the floats themselves. And one of those rehearsals was an absolute disaster. Some of the floats fell apart. The canopy of lights that the dancers were under for Cinderella ended up falling apart on them as well. One of the floats crashed into a building on Main Street, and two of the horses collapsed under the weight that they were trying to pull. Because yes, they used horses actually early on, not just cast members pulling them. Whew. Yeah, that's a nightmare situation. Now, when it came to the actual day of it opening, guess what? There were still dozens of engineers still working on those floats, all the way up until, well, really, until they went through the gates into the public. Ron went ahead and described this because he said how the electricians were jumping off the floats, like right before they go through the gates. And to him, this was like people jumping ship just prior to it sinking. And I mean, I've got to imagine, you're worried about this whole thing going to hell concerning that bad rehearsal, considering that you're trying to absolutely do what you can to finish it up right before it goes through the gates. That said, it worked. The parade was a huge, huge hit. So let's talk a little more about what made up that first parade. First, let's talk about the music, then we'll talk about the specific floats. So the music. The music uses this song called Baroque Hoedown as its main component. Now, first I've got to talk about a quick little controversy here. So I found it often stated that the Baroque Hoedown was first used in the electrical water pageant at Walt Disney World, but I have found little and solid sources to back this up other than a trivia book by Disney historian Dave Smith. On the other hand, Don Dorsey's website clearly talks about the song being selected and the original synthesizer versions not being created until May of 1972. Now, if that's the case, then clearly it was not used in synthesizer form in 1971 prior to that. Don Dorsey's site also talks about the discussions that were had and the selection of the song, which clearly is related to Main Street Electrical Parade. So the best I've got for my guess as to what really happened is that Baroque Hoedown was originally chosen for Main Street Electrical Parade. The synthesizer version was made over in May of 1972, and then it got transported over to Walt Disney World in the electrical water pageant. Until it eventually was replaced in 1977 over there because Walt Disney World started its own version of Main Street Electrical Parade. Now again, don't take that 100% because it is the best I can figure out. If anybody has a good primary source on that, let me know. I'd love to hear it. Okay, so let's talk about how Baroque Hoedown did get used in the Main Street Electrical Parade. So the idea of how it gets used often gets related over to It's a Small World, and this is a good example of how it gets used. Essentially, you use a short section of the music and then loop it again and again and again throughout the parade in this case. But you have some other music on top of it to go ahead and make it different in each section. So it's a 1 minute and 3 second section that went ahead and got looped over and over, which works beautifully. Now, it's a quick, catchy melody. It could be choreographed too. And this original song of the Baroque Hoedown was actually created by Jean-Jacques Perry and Gershon Kingsley. And Disney went ahead and got the rights to the song, and boom, they went with it because they went through a whole bunch of songs, but that was the one that just really worked for them. And so this was music director Jim Christensen who went ahead and put this together and was working on it. And he went ahead and brought in Paul Beaver because Paul Beaver at the time was considered the only guy for synth work in Hollywood. Synth, by the way, being short for synthesizers, as those are heavily used throughout this music. That is what gives it such a unique feel as compared to all kinds of other music. Now, they went ahead and met with good old Paul Beaver in May of 1972, and in just like a couple of weeks, he put together demos right off the bat, and frankly, they didn't have a lot of time as the parade opened in June. Now, there were 6 different musical scenes used in this, and they were played on a Moog synthesizer for all of that. Now, here's some stuff you might not know. At the end, the music just faded out. There was no extra special fanfare at the end. But also, at the beginning, that whole cool voice introduction of ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Main Street Electrical Parade and all that did not exist. Essentially, there was an oscillator sweep, and then the music simply faded in. That was it. No big fanfare at the beginning, none of the rest of that. The original Main Street Electrical Parade did not do that. Now, here's the other really cool thing about how that parade worked. The first show control system in existence was created for the Main Street Electrical Parade. Now, what it means when I say show control system is that the way we make sure the right music is playing when each section of the parade gets there, because they're not using a live band in this, as was a popular thing to do before, but we need to make sure everybody's hearing the right part at the right time. So essentially we create a whole bunch of trigger zones, which are about 70 to 100 feet long, and then they are radio activated by the floats themselves. So when the float gets to the right spot, it triggers that, and you hear the music for that section of the parade. Pretty cool, actually. And this is the first time that was ever used. Now, that oscillator sweep piece that I talked about that was actually the full intro, quote-unquote, at the time, that was actually manually done because they didn't have a radio trigger for that ahead of time because there's not a float right there for it. So that's pretty cool. I mean, it created music that everyone would hear in the same section for the same float as it's going by without having to have a live band. And this is something we're all super used to now because that's how all those parades work. Super, super cool. And it started right here with the Main Street Electrical Parade. Okay, so what were the original floats and sections for the original 1972 the Main Street Electrical Parade? Because it's not what you know it as probably nowadays. It's definitely different in 1972. So we had the Blue Fairy going ahead and starting things out. We've got some toy soldiers. We've got a Disneyland logo float that was there at the beginning. The Casey Jr. train is there pulling a big drum behind it that has the good old name of the Main Street Electrical Parade. Then on top of that, we have a few other sections. We have the Alice in Wonderland section, but this is not the Alice in Wonderland you might think of because most of it was butterfly and flower dancers, actual human cast members dancing. And then you had Alice on a snail and a simple little water fountain float, and that was it. Then in the Cinderella section, you had this ballroom canopy that was being carried and a whole bunch of dancers underneath it. And then you had a flat pumpkin coach. That was all there was for that. There was this cool Dumbo section that had bunches of circus animals. It had Dumbo and his mother. And it did have this really cool three-dimensional circus Calliope, which had Hippo and King Leonidas playing the organ in there. Then there was a Chinese dragon after that. It was actually flat. And there was potentially Small World. So It's a Small World. I found some sources that say it did exist in 1972, but I'm not convinced that it existed prior to 1977. So I'm unsure of that one, but I will put that out there for you. And then the finale for the parade. The parade has always had some kind of patriotic finale. At the beginning, it was the Stars and Stripes with Winnie the Pooh for President. So that was the original finale. So that's all there was. Now, it often gets talked about as if the whole parade was completely flat back in 1972. It really wasn't. Yes, there were a lot of flat pieces in it, most certainly, but things like the Blue Fairy, the Casey Jr. train, Mickey's Large Drum, some of the little whirly bugs, and the Circus Calliope were very, very dimensional. Now, some of that dimensionality was able to be taken advantage of by taking pre-existing floats that Disney already had and just putting lights on them, and that certainly helped them a bit. So that was the 1972 The Main Street Electrical Parade. So what has changed over its course of time up through 1996? Well, let's see. In 1973, quick little change, there was a three-dimensional Maleficent that replaced that flat Chinese dragon. And then it ran through 1973 and 1974, and then we had a 2-year hiatus from 1975 through 1976, because instead we had America on Parade running because it was in honor of the US Bicentennial in 1976. Now this gave them the opportunity for a huge redesign for 1977. And man, there was a lot done in this one. First, I'm going to talk about the music just like last time, and then the floats. Okay, so now we've brought in a new person to deal with all the music, and this is Don Dorsey. Now, Don Dorsey had actually gotten brought in originally for the America on Parade, and actually there's a really tragic reason as to why he did. It's because Paul Beaver had died really suddenly just a couple years ago. And while Don Dorsey was doing America on Parade, he knew that he wanted to work on Main Street Electrical Parade. So he started playing tracks and demos, and he had this great idea to create an opening fanfare to the parade. And he went ahead and showed it to the people in charge, and, well, they loved the work he had done, and they put him on it and told him, definitely, you're going ahead and doing this. And so he did. So that means Don Dorsey, along with Jack Wagner, often called the voice of Disneyland, well, they went ahead and updated and arranged the entire thing. Don Dorsey used 11 synthesizers to create the soundtrack, the updated version of it there. They also added things like creature sounds into it. There was a new perkier bass line that gave it even more pep than it had before. There were certain songs that were moved, new ones added because there were new floats in there. And whoa, just a lot of work done in there. Now, let's talk about that opening sequence a little bit too. So Don Dorsey had that cool idea for the new opening to the Main Street Electrical Parade, and it was going to make them have to do something new. Essentially, you start it up while there's silence out there, then you have this cool beginning, and then you've got to play it to a point where it can then switch to the main looping music that you hear again and again throughout the rest of the piece, without anyone noticing that you just did that. And that opening section being done that way is called the opening window, which is what Don Dorsey created. Now, this is used all the time in Disney parades now. This is a Disney signature. You're just used to it happening. But that was created by Don Dorsey back in 1977 for the Main Street Electrical Parade. There you go. That's another thing that was pioneered for the Main Street Electrical Parade that is now just one of those super common things you are used to all the time. Oh, and by the way, this is also where we certainly had the talking intro as well. That was part of that opening. Now that electro-synth-magnetic, well, that's actually came from Bob Yanni because that's what he called the new music when Don Dorsey did that newer version of it. And, well, they just put it in there because Bob Yanni wrote that announcement and in it went. Now, here's an interesting thing to note. The original intro there was read by Jack Wagner, good old voice of Disneyland, but it wasn't with anything special. He just read it out. The really cool things done to his voice through the vocoder, that was not done in 1977. That would be later, actually, and I'll get to it in a bit. Now let's talk about the floats themselves. As well as redoing the music and completely reworking it, they definitely went over those floats in 1975 and 76. We've got three-dimensional floats all throughout this now. We've got better battery power and fewer cables in there. The whole parade as a whole is longer and it's got a longer running time. Let's see, there's one thing that was completely just removed. There's no longer a Disneyland logo float in there. We have a few things that were replaced. Maleficent was replaced with Pete's Dragon, which, by the way, was a 1977 movie, so a lot of promotion going on. Then the Stars and Stripes ending was replaced with this really neat Disney neon finale that just ran for a short bit. Had this swirling mirrors with various Disney characters on it. Pretty cool. Then there were some floats that were updated, like the Alice in Wonderland float. Now she's up on a mushroom. There are multiple colors of mushrooms out there, a centipede, some turtles. And no more butterfly and flower dancers are out. Cinderella got some good upgrades. There's this cool staircase with Prince Charming. There's a clock tower. There's a three-dimensional pumpkin coach with Cinderella and the fairy godmother. Just completely upgraded right there. And Dumbo? Most of Dumbo is gone after that. Really only that three-dimensional circus Calliope carries over, because now we've got this bear balancing on barrels. We've got an elephant bathing. Cool stuff. And then there were two things that were completely new. First off, we added Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So we had just the Seven Dwarfs in there. Just that for the start. And then we had a briny deep section. Now that's from the movie Bed Knobs and Broomsticks, which came out in 1971, I'm pretty sure. And so it was relatively recent and definitely popular at the time. So you can tell, 1977 was big. Lots of stuff happened right there. But there were still some things yet to happen. Because the closing still just faded the music out. That's what happened, even after 1977. But in 1978, Disney went ahead and brought the Main Street Electrical Parade to the Orange Bowl halftime in January. And to pull that off, Don Dorsey had to go ahead and create a bunch of new music that would work for it, because there were longer sections for some of it, and multiple sections needed closings because it wouldn't work otherwise, not in that context. And one of the things he created was called the Fanfare of Lights to close it. And now? Well, Bob Yawning loved it so bloody much that, hey, summer of 78, that was coming right over there to the Main Street Electrical Parade. And so now, it had the ending you're more used to. Also had a quick little temporary Mickey's 50th birthday float that year, which you'll notice throughout the years they have a couple of special celebratory floats that'll pop up. A few more of those will come. Now we come to 1979, and 1979 was kind of this minor revision year. Not a huge one, but certainly a few. So first off, Don Dorsey was inspired by the original Battlestar Galactica, which premiered on TV in September of 1978. And the voices of those Cylons from the original, well, guess what? He wanted to use a cool vocoder voice like that for the Main Street Electrical Parade. So now we get the intro the way we're used to it. And then we certainly had some changes to the floats. Briny Deep got switched over for Pinocchio. Intriguingly, there was a whale in both, so hey, it switched over to Monster pretty well. We added a whole bunch of clowns and balloons to Dumbo. And that neon finale, well, now it's gone. It's over to the To Honor America climax. Big 108-foot long float, the one that we're used to nowadays. That's what still closes out the Main Street Electrical Parade when it comes around. That started in 1979. So the parade's getting a lot more similar to what we're used to, but it's still not quite there yet. So there were some other minor things happening here and there. 1980, we had a Disneyland 25th anniversary unit for a year. 1981, for the year, we had a special one for the Fox and the Hound since it was coming up in the summer. And then, well, the Main Street Electrical Parade went away for a couple of years in 1983 and 1984 because Flights of Fantasy was out. And this gave them time for another good-sized revision when it came back in 1985. So we took out the toy soldiers, they're out. Now we did a whole bunch in Alice in Wonderland with the caterpillars added in, the Cheshire Cats added in there, and so it's really looking like what we're used to now. We added in a cool fountain and the stepsisters over in Cinderella. The whole Peter Pan section, that got added here in 1985, so the Jolly Roger along with Smee's little rowboat following them. And Dumbo, we added this whole two-part circus there to replace the clowns that had been there before. And the Snow White? Now Snow White's looking more like we know, because instead of just the Seven Dwarfs, we've got Dopey's Mine Train, and we've got the Dwarfs' Diamond Mine in there. And also, over in the Pinocchio section, instead of the underwater, now we've replaced it with this Pleasure Island piece, which is a two-float section. Now this is probably pretty much the parade you would be used to if you have seen it in any of its recent takes out there in the parks. Now I'll tell you about some of the other temporary things that popped up just for a year here or there. Like in 1985, we did have a temporary Return to Oz float for the new movie coming out, and a Disneyland's 30th anniversary float, which is just like a logo float. That was really all it was. Then in 1988, we had a cool Mickey Mouse's 60th birthday float, and also Small World stopped being part of Main Street Electrical Parade at this point. And in 1990, we had a temporary Disneyland's 35th anniversary logo float. And there you go, that was the temporary things in there, at least to the best of my knowledge for what's in there. There might be something else that just didn't pop through in the sources I was looking at. Now the parade was coming to its end, because in 1996, that would be it. And they actually extended the time the parade was going to be open because it was just so popular. So they added an extra month on the end of it. And then they sold the light bulbs. All of those light bulbs used in it, they sold them in these cool commemorative boxes for $10 a piece. And that was the end of the Main Street Electrical Parade in its original incarnation over in Disneyland. And the parade that replaced it, Light Magic, next year, it failed. I mean, that was a huge flop, did not work. It's hard to go ahead and replace the Main Street Electrical Parade, I gotta tell you. Now that's the history of the original 24-year run of the Main Street Electrical Parade at Disneyland. Now there's a lot else to be able to talk about in this, and if you're interested, go ahead and let me know down below, because that parade, it was brought over to Walt Disney World at the Magic Kingdom in 1977, and it ran there off and on all the way through 2016. Heck, they even did a Hercules Electrical Parade just for one time and ran it over in 8 blocks in New York City. The parade was brought back to the Disneyland Resort over in Disney California Adventure for 10 years. Then it had some revivals at Disneyland. Heck, it ran over in Disneyland Paris for 12 years, Tokyo Disneyland for 11 years, and was then updated to the cool new Dream Lights, which they still use over there. And actually that music even got brought back. And then we also have the cool Paint the Night that debuted back in 2015. So there is a lot more to be able to talk about as far as what happened to the parade and what else inspired and where else it went. So if you're interested in any of that, definitely let me know. I gotta tell you, this is one cool parade. If you haven't seen it yet, hopefully you'll get a chance in some revival that will come here in the future. And until then, what about you? Have you seen the Main Street Electrical Parade? Do you have a favorite float or some aspect of its history? Let me know down below in the comments. And thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a like, share it with anyone you think will too, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you back here tomorrow for another new episode of Freeform Disney. Have a magical day, and may the Force be with you. Always.